Hello guys, welcome to the second class of Contemporary Spanish Politics. Today we're going to talk about nationalism in Spain. Remember that in our last class we talked about the territorial organization of the Spanish state, and we talked how Spain was divided into 17 self-governing communities, and also beyond that it was divided into municipalities and provinces. But the self-governing communities was the interesting part that. And the relation between the central state, what in Spain we call central state, and the US you will call federal state, because we are not federal state in Spain, and the self-governing communities. But all this comes from something else, and it comes from the concept of nationalism, which is a very interesting one to address, to try to understand all these, obviously, all this pro-independence movement in Catalonia, and how the state in Spain is divided into comunidades autónomas, and to understand why. So today's class is going to be divided in 3 different videos. In the first one, we're going to address the concept of nationalism and the relation between states and nations. In the second video, we're going to talk about the Basque nationalism and other nationalisms in Spain, for example, the Andalusian or the Galician. And in the last video, I'm going to talk about Catalan nationalism in particular, and beyond that, how is that affecting Spanish politics nowadays. So let's go ahead and talk about nationalism and what nationalism means and what types of nationalism we have. And as in social sciences, we have competing definitions and competing classifications. But I'm going to use this one because it's a traditional one and it's a relatively easy and simple one to understand. First, liberal nationalism. First, actually, before telling you about these 2 classifications of nationalism, let's go back to the time nationalism was created, because by the end of the day, nations are invented. There's not such a thing. It's the same as the states. Someone one day decided to divide a specific territory and separate from others. Nations was something that was created at the end of the 18th century, because with the French Revolution, they needed something that brought the people together, something to fight for in French Revolution. Remember, the French Revolution was a bourgeois revolution, and how will this bourgeoisie convince the people to join them when fighting against traditional monarchs and traditional powers? The answer was creating a national identity, a national feeling to fight for. And when creating this, at this time, how did they convince them? They convinced them because they told them they were going to be part of a political project. They were going to be citizens. They were going to be part of the state. And that's actually where liberal nationalism departs from. Citizenship. If you're willing to be part of this political project, you're a national of this state. If you think about the United States, very similar. It was created on this desire of being part of a political project. However, there's another way that a national identity can be created. And this is the case, for example, of Germany. How? And we call this ethnic nationalism. And it's through culture. We have certain cultural traits that bring us together. We have a similar religion, we have similar traditions, we share a language, we share a history. All these make us nationals, and around these concepts, we build our own identity. However, if you compare these 2 nationalisms, you will see that political or liberal nationalism is very inclusive. If you want to be part of a project, you can be part of a project. Whether ethnic nationalism or cultural nationalism is exclusive, because only certain people with certain traits can be part of that nation. And this cannot be changed, because by the end of the day, obviously language can be understood, but history or ethnicity or religion, this is something individual. And this is very dangerous nowadays in time of populism. How can this affect the dynamics of politics? And obviously, nationalism is a tool that's being used by populists to close nations on their own. I'm sure you can think of a few examples, and some of them very close to yourselves nowadays. This is interesting because obviously, from this concept that we have created at the end of the 18th century, we have to make sure whether we fit the concept of the state, who has the sovereignty, who has the power over a territory, and this concept of nation. And obviously, depending on the definition of nation we're going to use, the fit will be better or worse. But we can take constitutions to assess whether this is happening in the world or not, whether this is a perfect fit or not. For example, if we go to Ecuador, Ecuadorian constitution, we can see that already Ecuadorian constitution says that Ecuador has several nations within one state, peoples and nations in the single and indivisible Ecuadorian state. So there's not always a perfect fit. For example, in Ecuador, there are several nationalities, several indigenous nationalities, while there's only one state. There are others there's a perfect fit. France, for example, is one of these cases that actually is almost a perfect fit. But for example, if we look at Spain, what do we have here? Our constitution says that there's one Spanish nation with several nationalities. If you remember the history of our transition, while we were drafting our constitution, we were trying to make everyone happy with the project. And that's how we got it, because we said that Spain is one nation, but at the same time it has nationalities. So the answer is clear. Spain has more than one national identity. And that's what we're going to be talking about in the next videos. Because if we talk about Spanish history, and I'm going to briefly address this before we move into other Spanish nationalisms, Spanish history is rather recent. Spain, if we go back in history, was several kingdoms that came together to form one single state. And obviously, this history is diverse. And if you look at languages, I think I told you this in class. I'm originally from Galicia. The language I speak there is not Spanish, it's Galician. So there are differences, there are cultural traits that are different. So for the ethnic definition of nationalism, we can opt for several nationalities in Spain. Well, if we used the liberal definition of nationalism, we can talk about one Spanish nationality, one Spanish nation, because it's one single political project, or maybe not, from what you took from last class. So we can talk, if you know about history and the time, you don't need to know this for the final exam, but if you know about Spanish history, if you talk about Isabel and Ferdinand, the Catholic monarch, she was Queen of Castilla, he was King of Aragon, and after their marriage, both crowns fell under the same person. But it was only then, after their marriage in 1469, when we have one single ruler of both kingdoms, of all the kingdoms in the peninsula. We have to go ahead up until the 1700s, when the term Kingdom of Spain is used for the first time. Before that, the monarch was King of Aragon and King of Castilla. It didn't matter. But it was only after 1700s that we use the term Spain, and we can talk about one single state. And the Spanish nation, when is it built? Is built in 1812. In 1812, we were actually fighting against the French. We were fighting against Napoleon, and we reproduced our first constitution in 1412. And from there, we can start talking about a Spanish national identity. On the one hand, brought together by the constitution, but also created by the opposition to the French that had invaded almost the whole territory of Spain, with the exception of Cadiz. So the historical background of our nationalism is that is something that several nations habitated this territory, this state beforehand. Francoism made an effort to bring everyone together and to neglect cultural nationalism in several areas of Spain. Catalonia, Basque Country, or Galicia, the regional languages, the languages of these areas could not be spoken. Only Spanish was allowed. And the current events, well, we'll talk about them in the following videos. So keep tuned. See ya!